5. With Jupiter at the zenith. Eleazar ben Yair sat on the still warm steps of the courtyard that had once been a place of relaxation for Herod's officers. It was a breathless night. It seemed as if the great wind had swept away all the air in the desert, and consequently all sounds, however feeble, were magnified until the politely muffled cough of a neighbor became a rude barking, and even the padding of bare feet became a heavy sound. Looking up at the stars, Eleazar thought it would be like this, when, at last, the world emitted a final sob and died. It would be as now, he decided, although the awesome tranquility would not belong to the Romans or be of their creation. Twice a day they fed the Jews laboring on the ramp, and so twice a day this great silence enwrapped the mountain, and prevailed until the simple meal was finished, whereupon the monstrous, all-pervading noise would commence again. On this day, another attempt to stop the noise had failed. While the fierce wind was still blowing, Eleazar had appeared before the council, and after a long session of pleading and cajoling, he had finally obtained permission to roll the great stones down upon them more than once. He had been called a murderer. His plan had been to strike quickly, then recoil to some protection while observing the effect, then strike again and again, according to the degree of disorganization. Disorganization on the ramp. If the plans of a man would only behave. He had foreseen that a breach in the wall would be necessary, since it would be impossible to lift the lethal-sized stones over the top. And so an opening had been cleared just before dawn, and when the first stones rolled down, the ramp all was as he had predicted it would be. Both workers and overseers panicked. Only the whimpering of those still alive on the ramp broke the great silence which followed, and on Masada there was hope again. Yes, soon it seemed as if Flavius Silva had been waiting for such an opportunity. His reply had been disciplined and terribly efficient. Before the sun climbed above Masada, he concentrated all the fire of his ballistas, catapults, and Arab bowmen on the narrow target presented by the breach in the rampart. 5 men of Masada had been killed before the effort had been abandoned as hopeless. Adonai. Work on the ramp had been delayed but half of the morning. Now in the night Eleazar was grateful for the consideration of the consul and the relatives of the slain. They had reproached only with their eyes. So, good friends, you know that I die inside. Reuben sat beside him watching the stars, with his head tipped back and his mouth open in wonder. Miriam also squatted beside him, her strong arms hunkered forward over her knees, her skirt pulled up and her thighs spread wide to receive the cooling night air. Reuben pointed to a star and asked its name, and Eleazar told him it was Mizar. But when she had asked the name of several other stars, he confessed that he did not know them. And then immediately, to preserve Reuben's faith in his knowing everything, he explained that the twin stars directly in line with his son's nose were Castor and Pollux, the guardians of storm-beset sailors, and in the future Reuben could identify them for himself if he would remember they were on the left hand of Orion's belt. The future? For Reuben? Eleazar sighed. Reuben's future would all have to be lived within the next few days. "Why don't the stars make a noise when they move?" Reuben asked. "Maybe they do," Eleazar answered, and for an instant he caught and cherished a look of amusement about Miriam's mouth and eyes, because it encouraged him to imagine this was the step in front of his head by the Sea of Galilee. This might be an evening when neighbors came to speak of the mullet and where they had been caught that day, and later Miriam would sing for their guests. He could still so easily hear her high, clear voice trembling against the stillness of the evening, echoing out and away across the gentle lapping of the sea. Then each guest would demand his favorite, "The song of Deborah, the song of Hannah," and he would protest that Miriam would be singing all night if she tried to satisfy them all. "Do we come from the same star as the Romans?" Reuben asked suddenly. He heard Miriam chuckle. Then she said, "O magician with words, I wait impatiently for thy answer to that one." Eleazar cleared his throat with great deliberation. Trading insults with a Roman general was easy compared to the challenge of complete innocence. "One cannot exactly say we came from a star," he began uncertainly. "We have always been right here. People have to start somewhere. Did we start in Judea?" "We were all the sons of Jacob. Mother is not the son of anyone," Reuben said flatly. Over Miriam's soft laughter, he told how the 12 sons of Jacob had become fathers themselves, and how their families had multiplied until they became tribes that had inherited both Israel and the promises made to Abraham, and thus became the people of God. He paused and wondered if he should tell Reuben it had all come to pass exactly as the prophets had foretold. He decided against it. "My son," he thought, "has the right to resolve for himself if he believes such things, and now every word from my lips becomes the truth." "Thank you, my son. You who are a little old man, who have already seen more people killed than you have years on earth, who in spite of our calamities are still able to regard the stars as living things, accept my secret gratitude for your faith." "Supposing you could buy one of those stars," he asked Reuben, "which one would you choose?" Reuben pointed without hesitation at the Procyon. "That one." Then he pointed at Regulus. "That one. I will buy it for Shimeon." "Shimeon?" For a moment Eleazar knew again the fierce bond between small boys, for long ago he had also had a friend named Shimeon, and he remembered there had been times when he would have died for him. Suddenly all of his dark thoughts were in retreat, and he yearned to prolong this moment. "And if you and Shimeon were to journey to that star to examine it before you bought it, is there anyone else you would take with you?" "No, Shimeon and I are enough people for a whole world." "Well, maybe Hodiah could go." "Hodiah?" Eleazar slapped his leg and appeared to be astounded. "Hodiah is a girl." "Yes, but she can run as fast as most boys." "And she could cook for us." Man's first beast of burden, Miriam said quickly. She reached for Reuben's hand and pulled him to his feet. If you sit up with your father much longer, Dawn will take your star. Come to sleep. She stood on her toes to kiss Eleazar and smiled when he held her silently in his arms. At last, when he released her, she turned away into the starlight with Reuben still clutching her hand. And as they vanished into the black shadow which marked the entrance to their quarters, Eleazar thought how this night's leave-taking of his wife and son had been as in the long ago. He must be careful. Miriam had sensed his despair and made a show of concern for the boy's sleep, when she must suspect he might soon sleep forever. (5.2) There was a certain place outside the low eastern wall of the camp which had become very dear to Cornelius and Albinus. It was situated almost directly opposite the eastern gate of Silva's own camp and near a promontory where the circumvallation met a sheer cliff and terminated. Here they could look up at the dark outline of Masada, or almost straight down into the wadi below, or back toward the camp itself and Falco's tent. Because of the impossibility of anyone scaling the cliff, there were no guards patrolling the vicinity, nor was it likely anyone would pass this way since all normal paths were at some distance from it. Thus, once arrived there, both Cornelius and Albinus enjoyed a sense of privacy they had never known since being impressed into Falco's service. Here, beneath the stars, with their master unable to summon them at his very whim, they gave themselves utterly to each other. Here, toying and teasing, sometimes even pretending indifference or acting in pique at some imagined slight, they declared their mutual adoration and postponed their physical climaxes with ever-increasing skill. It was Cornelius, having spent himself, who opened his eyes and saw what suddenly caused his body to again become rigid. He gently pushed Albinus away from him and whispered, "Look, see who else likes to be alone." Albinus rose and wiped at his lips and saw the two figures moving beneath the stars. He saw how they walked rapidly and with apparent purpose toward Masada, and he was perplexed because they were inside the circumvallation, and one appeared to be a woman. Ahead of her, a soldier's helmet glinted in the starlight. The soldier turned his face to glance back at her. Then both sank from view as they entered a narrow wadi. "It is the Jewess, I'm sure," Cornelius said. "And a common soldier? Why? Who knows where a bitch in heat may choose to rut? It doesn't make sense. Silva would bury her alive if he knew." After a moment, Cornelius pressed his hand gently against Albinus's cheek, and said, "Exactly." He moved quickly to the edge of the cliff and then lay down on his belly. Albinus joined him, and they inched their way forward until they could look straight down upon the wadi below. "Why should they go so far?" he asked in disappointment. "He is no common soldier, I believe. I could swear I recognized him as the centurion Gemenis. He is not risking his life but for a sniff." Suddenly Cornelius pointed down at the very bottom of the cliff. Again there was the momentary reflection of a star on polished metal, and almost immediately they were able to define two figures moving downward along the course of the wadi. They watched in silent fascination until the figures turned around the northern extremity of Masada, vanished momentarily in the depression, and then reappeared walking east. So? Cornelius grunted. There is more here than a horny female and a willing soldier. And I would be even less surprised if Pomponius Falco might not greatly value such information. We had better not give him cause to know we were here together. Of course not. I will go back to the camp and the vicinity of the Jewess's family, where I have been vigilantly observing as usual. I will say I saw her leave the tent alone. You were simply taking a stroll out for the cool air, and by chance you saw this. Because of our love of our master, we decided he might like to put our observations together. We accomplish several things. We divert his thoughts from our own meeting here, if he has any. We prove our devotion to duty, and who knows what he may do with such information. It may even be possible he will commend us, in which event our next meeting here will be that much easier to arrange. For a time, Eleazar stood listening to the revival of the activity on the ramp, and he wondered at the dulled anxieties of those on Masada who were already asleep. In the direction of the eastern casemates he heard the voice of a man he was certain must be Essene. He was reading aloud, "In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. Let me never be ashamed. Deliver me in thy righteousness. Bow down thine ear to me. Deliver me speedily. Be thou my strong rock, for a house of defense to save me. For thou art my rock and my fortress." Oh, all very well, as Eleazar thought. If the man will gather strength for himself from that source, then the rock, which is actually beneath his feet, will not die quite so soon. But if we lean too heavily on the Scriptures, then the rock of Masada is certainly lost. He left the courtyard and strode toward his favorite place along the eastern rampart. The wall was built along a vertical precipice which would be impossible to scale, so no sentries patrolled the area. There, according to his custom, he could look out across the Dead Sea toward the rumpled hills of Moab, and each night keep his solitary vigil. When he reached the rampart, he stood for a moment gazing down upon the eastern camps of the Romans and the faint outline of the circumvallation, and he sighed heavily. A rabbi had once told him that a man who lived entirely by the Scriptures was a fool. Likewise, then, would not he who relied on the timely arrival of miracles simply because the Scriptures told of them also be a fool? He spread his big hands above his head and addressed the stars in a hoarse whisper, and the words he found were comfortable for him, although he knew they would not be approved by Hillel or any other priest. They would insist on the orthodox prayer, the impersonal and pompous praise of God which began with the salutation, "Our Father, who art in heaven," and continued with a series of requests. It was like the Shema, a prayer so long ground beneath the millstones of endless and exact repetition, he now found it more annoying than inspiring. Lately he had been given to choosing his own words, expressing his worship more directly with his head unbowed and his eyes wide open to appreciate the heavens. "Almighty God," he began, "thank you for my sight. Thank you for my hearing, for my senses of smell and touch. Thank you for the morning dew and the bounty of the sea. Thank you for the temporary privilege to breathe this desert night. Thank you for life, Almighty God. may I deserve it. When I do not, take it away." He stepped down from the rampart and walked slowly across the gentle rolling terrain of Masada. He walked with his hands folded behind him, so deep in meditation he failed to notice a commotion near the eastern gate. "My little red stone island," he mused, "thou art flinty and hard and ugly in the extreme, the last morsel of Israel to be devoured by the lion. And we who inhabit your iron crust are doomed with you unless a miracle actually does occur." His concentration was so intense he strayed from the usual worn pathway. He stumbled in the darkness, and as he turned quickly to avoid falling, his shin struck a large rock. When he recognized it as one of the hundreds hurled by the catapults of the Romans, he groaned in chagrin. Hashem! How could a poor stumbling human being, a clumsy sailor who could not find his way in the dark, honestly expect to cause a very necessary miracle? Ridiculous. He was massaging his shin and reflecting on how the Romans had finally managed to humble Eleazar, the fierce zealot, bringing him to his knees, in fact, when he heard a woman's raging scream. Then, from the vicinity of the eastern gate, he heard the profane shouts of several men. He forgot his pain and moved quickly toward the voices. In the deeper shadows near the gate he found a cluster of men surrounding a solitary woman. He could not recognize her, although, as she cursed her audience in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, he was immediately impressed with her vocabulary. She was crouched like a cornered animal, whirling quickly to avoid surprise and keeping one arm outstretched. Then Eleazar saw a knife in her hand, and he asked the man next to him who the woman was. Tempters were often short on Masada. Oh, yes, how well I know my passionate people, he thought, but women usually limited physical attacks to their teeth and fingernails. "A cactus has sprung from the desert in the form of a woman," the man answered. Then, recognizing Eleazar, he added, "Oh, believe me that her skin bristles with spikes." When he held out his fist, Eleazar saw it was covered with blood. Each time a part of the circle began to close in on her, the woman would leap forward the nearest offender and make a violent sweep with her blade. Her defiance caused the men to taunt each other. Who would be the first to capture this waspish female and tame her? "You, Ananias, there is a prize for a lucky bachelor. Imagine what it would be like to bury your snook in her. Now is the chance to prove your quickness, Josiah. 10 shekels you will not take the blade from her. Elijah, provoke her next time she turns with a pinch in the butt." "Whose woman is she?" Eleazar asked. "She came up the snake path. Chaim caught her at the gate, but she slipped away. She's quick and mean and undoubtedly a spy." Eleazar heard a man on the opposite side of the circle call out, "Now the Romans are sending us their whores." Another man hooted, "The bitch claims to be a Jewess. Oh, what a fine lady she must be, flat on her back with her legs spread wide to receive the eagle's beak. Throw her back where she came from and watch the Romans fornicate with a bag of bones." For a moment there was silence as the circle became smaller. It was broken only by the woman who said she had come to see Eleazar ben Yair and no other. Eleazar stepped into the circle and stood looking down at her. She started to lunge at him with the knife. He moved quickly aside, and as the blade flashed past, he caught her wrist. He held her at arm's length while he twisted her hand until the blade fell to the ground. And he thought he had been lucky indeed to disarm her so quickly. there being no adversary so cunning and so cruel as a furious woman. Holding her firmly, he told her his name and saw her temper suddenly ease. "Yes," she said, searching his face in the starlight. "I believe you. I would know that voice anywhere. Use it to call off this pack of hyenas." "Listen to her give orders," a man behind Eleazar said. "The whore has become a queen." She whirled on the man, almost breaking Eleazar's hold. "If you scum are Jews, I would have been better born an Egyptian. I can be sure from the stink of your breath your mother slept with a dromedary." "Where did you come from?" Eleazar demanded. "I escaped from below. I have much to tell you of the Romans." "Say it then!" He closed his great hand more tightly around her wrist. "I will tell it to you alone." Other men, attracted by the unusual activity near the eastern gate, were joining the circle, and a few women, roused, were approaching from the casement dwellings. Soon Eleazar knew the whole of Masada would arrive, including the council. Intense curiosity was part of the constant fear which had gradually infected every person on Masada. Trifling events became matters of grave importance. Everyone concerned himself mightily with a family fight, or a broken wine jar, or a minute change in the ration of passing figs. Eleazar knew that if even one of the council members saw this woman, he would feel obliged to notify the others lest they label him secretive, and anything worthwhile the woman might have to say would be buried in endless accusations and arguments. The council was like a boat without a keel, he thought, heeling to one side or the other at the slightest breeze, making as much leeway as headway. He stepped to her side as if seeking better light from the stars. He regarded her quizzically and raised his voice so that all those about him would hear. "I know you," he said. "You are Jedida, sister of Tarshish. We are related." He was relieved to see her hesitate only an instant, and then she quickly kissed his hand. "I regret your reception," he said with a forced show of apology. "We are all irritable here." He put his arm around her protectively and added that he would take her to his wife. Then, before too many questions were asked, he escorted her through the circle of curious faces. Once they were free, he quickened his pace, and though she was still breathing heavily from her exertions, he was gratified to see her follow him without protest. Soon they came to the courtyard of his quarters. Just inside the gate, he turned into the deepest shadows. When they had melted into the darkness, he took her firmly by the arms and held her before him. He caught the scent of perfume, and somehow it made him angry. He passed his fingers across the palms of her hands, and finding them smooth, put down an urge to strike her. "My friends were right," he said coldly. "Why should the Romans send me their toys? My escape was arranged by Silva himself." "Stop lying! Who would choose to escape up here?" She told him how Silva wanted to meet him in secret, and had sent her to bear the message because he believed a man would be killed before he could deliver it. So, while other women of Israel have plunged knives into their vaginas rather than accept a Roman, you have made a very good thing of it, while other women die on the ramp. I did not climb a mountain to be preached at. If you will meet with Silva, I may save more Jews than your stupid pride has killed." Again he resisted the temptation to strike her. "The Roman need only raise his voice if he would speak with me. You have both tried that without the least success." He wants to meet you alone. I have nothing to gain by listening to Roman lies. You might even have something to lose. If peace came to Masada, then where would you be? Just another Jew. And you would not like that, would you, Eleazar ben Yair? Your power would be gone, and your great voice would no longer capture your little private army or irritate the Romans. You would not be a hero any longer, and that is more than a man like you can bear. I will tell you that for a time even I was impressed by your words. But now you are a disappointment. If a great Roman general can curb his pride and climb to you, he would climb here alone. Where was the hidden trick, he wondered. Why should Silva take the slightest chance on his personal safety when he must certainly believe victory was near? He has given his right hand. He will be alone, she said. Eleazar thought, as he had so many times before, how unpredictable the Romans invariably proved to be. Their crimes could not be repaid until the stars fell out of the heavens, and yet, in almost 7 long years of warring against them, he had never heard of a Roman commander betraying the oath of his right hand. And a miracle? Perhaps there might be one in the offing, even if it had to be contrived by Eleazar ben Yair. He glanced up at the stars. Go to your Roman, he said finally. Tell him, when Jupiter is at the zenith, to begin his climb. Continued. Flavius Silva could not remember when his mind had been so disordered. It seemed as if his thoughts had gone to war against each other, and with each new development of this extraordinary, eventful night, he became alternately elated and dejected. He chided himself. I am fretting like some Syrian usurer caught with a risky investment. What a roll call of conflicting contingencies. And innocent of all, Epos had placed the flask of wine temptingly in its usual place on the table. Yet not a drop must moisten your lips this night. If you would climb Masada and meet face to face with such an eloquent scoundrel as Eleazar ben Yair, then all of your wits had best be drawn up in the most formidable line of battle, with the hastati of verbs and nouns where they belonged in front line, the principes of insults in the second rank, and the triarii of patience in the third. This was a military adventure so rare and unpredictable of result there had been no point in discussing it with staff. They would only wonder what possible advantage could come of your meeting alone with a verminous Jew. And well they might inquire, which was precisely why their opinions had not been sought. All the more reason to remember that military innovations are considered disastrous if they do not succeed brilliantly, and other better-known causes are subscribed to the success if they do. Only if an invitation fails is it recognized as being responsible for the resulting calamity, and the innovator himself may soon find himself hanging by his testicles. Hence no wine. Tonight the enemy in the flask is more dangerous than the one on the mountain. Apparently, something has already gone wrong, for where is Shiva? Rosianus Geminus had escorted her to the perimeter of the eastern camp, and after a show of struggle, let her slip away. He had reported all had gone smooth, and even the guards posted along the eastern circumvallation had been convinced a Jewish woman prisoner had escaped. Later, Jimenez had proceeded to the northeastern camp, and had there explained to the sentries how a woman would eventually appear bearing the correct password for the night, Venus Genetrix. It was the same wording ascribed on the Tessara, which had been carried through the camp at twilight by their own centurions. Well enough, but then why was Sheva so long overdue? Certainly Eleazar ben Yair would not harm one of his own kind. He had only to tell her yes or no and send her on her way. Yet a Jew? Who knew what a Jew would do? To divert his increasing concern, Silva had tried reading the history of the world by Nicholas of Damascus, but he had found it a poor distraction from the magnetic power of the wine flask. Away, grape! There are other excitements this night. Here is an interminable history of ancient Rome by one Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who must be the world's greatest bore. Here is Strabo's geography of the empire. Who cares? I am making geography. Here is a volume on dreams by Artemidorus. If a man manages to sleep in this wretched desert, does he need help with his nightmares? Sheva, he said aloud, you are overdue. He reached for the wine flask, hesitated, then placed it carefully under the table. Then he paced for a while and attempted to concentrate upon his house in Praeneste. Supposing, he thought, I do marry the woman. There must be structural changes in the house. At the very least, an addition to the cubicula, since the present sleeping arrangement is not really designed for two. It had indeed, he remembered, with pleased astonishment, been planned by a man who had despaired of ever again being capable of copulation, much less once again given service to the Greek god Hymen. Marriage would bring alterations to life, which would be pleasant, but also alterations to an almost completed house. Every true friend had warned, do not change a stone once it has been put in place. Resist all temptation to have constructual second thoughts, or you will certainly go bankrupt. Now, if a black-eyed Jewish designs to consent, the plumbing will have to be rerouted. Additional window openings fitted into the general scheme and more expensive lapis specularis must be mined and polished to cover those openings. And in the hands of that prime idiot, that mentally retarded Antonius Mamilianus, who had the presumption to call himself an architect, the total expense might well fulfill the dire predictions of your gloomiest friends. The bank of Maximus and Proculus was not in the business of philanthropy. They knew to the last as what was already invested in the house, and they were equally aware of your 60,000 sesterces salary as procurator of Judea. Without changing the expression in their eyes or moving their lips in the slightest, without any real knowledge of the territory involved, those coin-jingling buzzards could estimate how meager the loot might be for any general who followed after Titus, and they would balance the equation against the 5% inheritance tax if their military client was regrettably killed in the line of duty, and divide it by the 5% tax on the additional slaves he would need if he survived. And they would say this man suffers delusions of grandeur, which in our language means a poor business risks. And let us not only refuse to lend him more, but increase the pressure on him to pay off what is outstanding. The firm of Maximus and Proculus was not even remotely interested in the kind of numbers which enabled them to do business in such high-handed fashion. They cared not that Roman legionaries, under the leadership of certain indebted Roman generals, regularly marched 20 miles in 5 hours or 24 at quick time, and while they were about it, carried an incredible 60 pounds of gear in addition to their weapons. Such soldiers kept the teeth of the world's barbarians from the soft throats of Maximus and Proculus and all their kind, a fact which failed utterly to alter their rate of interest. So, the whole idea was impossible to begin with, and who needed, do you think, who are to even speculate on marrying a Jewess? The whole idea was impossible to begin with. And who indeed do you think you are to even speculate on marrying a Jewess? Do you, of all men, have to be told by some minor bureaucrat that no Roman citizen may marry a non-citizen without the consent of the Senate and the Emperor? Or would you prefer to be told in his pithy manner by Vespasian himself that any intelligent man past the age of 30 should follow his own example and take a concubine rather than bind himself in the nuisance of marriage? The gossips claimed Titus had pleaded with his father to authorize his own marriage to the Jewish Bernice, and had been refused. If a prince could not succeed, what hope for you? And it would be boorish in the extreme to ask good friend Titus to confer Roman citizenship on Sheva, and thus clear the way, when he would not so honor his Bernice. Nor had he thus far made any citizenship arrangement for Tiberius Alexander, the Jew who had not only been formerly governor of Alexandria, but had actually served as Titus's chief of staff during the siege of Jerusalem. Oh no, you might put spittle on your seal ring so the wax would not stick, but you did so discreetly. And the very great had a way of not always being flattered by intimidation. The very great. Of the hundreds of Roman generals scattered across the world, who else had such a close relationship with Titus? It was a bond forged in danger, hammered into shape by mutual admiration and devotion. It was as true as your sword of Spanish iron, as incomparable and precious as that mineral to any other. He changed the pattern of his pacing from a direct traverse of his tent to an egg-shaped circuit of the table. I should sit down, he thought, or I will be dragging my leg up the mountain. But I cannot, while the woman I suddenly regard as treasure walks alone through a battlefield. Have I been deserted by all the gods? Where in the name of each and every one of you is Sheva? Ordinarily, the most exciting event of the entire week would have been the letter from Titus that had been brought by special courier earlier in the evening. Sheva had not been gone long on her mission then, actually, he remembered. She could not have as yet arrived at the summit of Masada. Consequently, the letter had come at a time of waiting, and he had been able to give it his full attention. It had been mostly a chatty letter, such as brothers who were fond of each other might enjoy. Except for the very last part, it was not a communication from a prince to a soldier, but a sharing of views, exactly as it had been when you were young tribunes together in Germany. Here a prince had begun with a most memorable salutation. Greetings to my esteemed comrade at arms. What soldier could ask for more? Next came an apology for not writing, my dear friend Flavia Silva, more often, but the press of affairs in the capital had been extraordinary, and father has been turning more and more matters over to me. Dear friend, you cannot imagine the problems both amusing and tragic which result from the wild explosion of population this city now enjoys, or should I say suffers. Besides ourselves, who really are too few, and I hope all the others never count our noses and discover how few we are, there have come more Greeks, Syrians, Jews, and Egyptians, all of whom barely tolerate each other. In addition, there have arrived untold numbers of Armenians, Ethiopians, and Arabs with a seasoning of Bithynians, Cappadocians, and Parthians. Most of these elements are now gathered into colonies as exclusive of the rest of the city as their national origins. Even more noxious and restless is a sort of floating population who eat wherever they can squat and sleep wherever they can find space to lie down. They seem to come and go, and it is impossible to keep track of these people with the aim of putting them into a good purpose. They are mostly barbarians from Dalmatia, Thrace, and Germany, and the occasional savage from Britain who exhibit their tattoos as if they were medals. Lately, there has been a virtual invasion of Gauls stalking about the streets as if they owned them and twisting their disgusting mustachios as if they were flags of pride. How can we ever hope to unite such a variety of peoples? I am personally of the opinion we are overly generous in opening our gates to the rest of the world, particularly when so very many of our visitors or self-adopted residents have not the faintest notion of appropriate sanitation. They urinate or defecate wherever or whenever the mood inspires them, and the situation is not improved by Vespasian's new tax on use of our public facilities. Knowing father, you may smile when you learn that upon my objection to the recently imposed tax on public urinals, he held a coin before my nostrils and inquired if I found the smell objectionable. Silva tried to smile as he had during his first reading of the incident, but he found it impossible now. Titus was being a bit harsh on his father. Someone had to rescue the insolvent Roman treasury, and there was the final conquest of Britain to be financed. Alas, if Vespasian could only say a few sharp words to one Antonius Mamilianus, the world's most extravagant architect. His bad leg was beginning to throb, so he sat down at the table. As if by plan, his foot struck the wine flask, but instead of reaching for it, as his desire begged him, he deliberately reached for Titus's letter. By and by, one of my centurions brought me this jewel of graffiti dedicated to our goddess of sewers, fair Closina, goddess of this place, daily resort of all ye human race. Graciously grant my offering may flow, nor rudely swift, nor ostentatively slow. The centurion had copied it on a paper which I recommended he anoint with the juice of cedar to preserve it forever from moths and rottenness. Dear friend, I pass on to you these trivialities because I know full well what it is like to campaign far from home, and particularly in what barren land where duty now holds you. In some respects, it is worse than exile because you cannot nurse your natural longings of either resentment or revenge. Among other chores Father has thrown my way, please do not think public sanitation is my principal responsibility, although from the foregoing you might well have reason to believe so, is command of the Praetorian Guard, which is in healthy morale, and the civil courts, which are in an incredible mess. You will recall that during the civil wars a great deal of property was appropriated on one excuse or another, and naturally the abused are suing for retribution. There are now so many cases, and the court calendars are so far behind, many of the litigants will never reach trial in their lifetimes unless we find some way to circumnavigate the regular legal proceedings, which are so ponderous. I am doing my best to alleviate this unfortunate impasse, and while involved in it, will try to correct another injustice which has also been too long a part of the Roman legal scene. I believe it should be unlawful for any person, citizen, or freedman to be tried under several laws for the same offense. Such a procedure places a person in double jeopardy, or more, and it seems that only the most influential or cunning scoundrels can escape such a net, while too often the innocent or half guilty are convicted. Silva paused in his reading and listened. Some time ago he had been aware of a cessation in the sounds from the ramp. He recognized it as the audible measurement of mealtime. Now, of course, the predominating sound had resumed and became an eternal presence, only to be noticed when it ceased again. In his reply to Titus, he must include his opinion that this was most certainly the noisiest camp ever to be maintained in the history of the Roman armies. Why not describe how, after long exposure to this perpetual turmoil, it was possible to select sounds? For example, just now there are the voices of the guards outside. It is possible to sense the tone of their voices, if not the actual substance of their words. No. Their sudden speech had not been caused by the approach of Jimenez escorting Sheva. Would it be an exaggeration to report that those who actually stood duty at the ramp had developed such acute powers of hearing sounds other than those produced by their laborious environment? They could actually detect the approach of arrows? Nonsense. Yet so they claimed. Should you recommend to Titus, not altogether fastidiously, that if ever new forms of torture were required for obstinate criminals, he might well consider prolonged exposure to massive noise? Our silence, such as now seems to have possessed your guards. Were they all asleep? Could they not at least engage in some trivial chatter to pass the time? He read again what he had already thrice reviewed. So much building is in progress, you would not know Rome. Father is on a building spree, which leads me to believe the many caustic remarks about his parsimony may have finally gored his pride. Among other structures, he is proceeding with his temple of peace, of which more later. Then I am rather embarrassed to report he is building an arch in my name, which will eventually be embellished with carvings depicting our capture of Jerusalem. Last week I viewed some of the preliminary work, the city burning, which I thought very well done and most accurate, and another panel representing myself driving a chariot, with which my daughter found most grievous fault. She exclaimed the figure standing so proudly did not resemble her father in the slightest, because he was much too beautiful. Ah, the young! While on the subject of construction, I must tell you that I had occasion to pass through Praeneste not long ago, and there pause to explore your new villa, which had been pointed out to me. Hearty congratulations! It will one day be a place of well-earned repose for a citizen and a soldier who has served the empire well. I look forward to the day when, in our advanced years, I may come to visit you there, and we can reminisce of times when our young heads concentrated for long only on the same subject as the heads of our penises. Perhaps you have already attended to the matter, but I would like to make one suggestion concerning your villa. Do, by all means, engage a talented muralist. Our architecture is essentially rather cold of line, and I find the present extensive employment of murals most refreshing. Do you now, dear friend Titus? I also find well-done murals contribute greatly to the charm of a house, but is there anything more but is there anything more annoying and inescapable than a badly done mural? And good painters charge fortunes, my dear rich prince, who will never have to consider such details. But never mind. Stay you, and I will stay I. For what was it Epicurus said? I shall give you a rule by which to measure yourself and your development. In that day you will come into your own when you realize that the successful are of all men most miserable. A drop of sweat left his chin and splattered on the letter. He flicked it from the surface of the paper with a sense of satisfaction. There, man's talent for acclimation to his environment is once more proven. In spite of the continuous roar outside my tent, I actually heard the droplet splat. Now, how can we focus this same wondrous ability on ignoring heat? How can we overcome the natural advantage of the Jews whose blood has had 100 generations beneath this sun? It will please you to know, Father has also devoted himself to improving the medical situation. He has instituted a campaign to be rid of the quacks who have so long infested Rome, and he has opened auditoriums for instruction in the art of medicine. The professors are paid by the state, and the graduate doctors will be the only men legally authorized to practice. Father himself is still suffering from the foot wound he took at Japata, which he repaired by a clumsy-fingered charlatan who has since perished of his own remedies. There are times during depressive weather when Father limps rather badly, which misery, shared with you, may partially account for his sympathy and great fondness for you. He paused and wiped the sweat from his face, lest another drop stain the letter. If my bad leg holds the affection of Vespasian, then it is more than worth it, for he has never been known to forsake those who somehow come to his favor. Ha! Here it is again. Now Titus leads gently into the true meat of the letter. After thrice reading, the message seems unmistakable. Actually, Father has not been of good cheer since he closed the gate to the temple of Janus almost 3 years ago. When the spoils from Jerusalem were all assembled, even he was impressed with the golden table, the candelabra, etc., and he commanded these should be deposited in his new temple of peace, along with the innumerable other treasures gathered from all over the world. In a sense, this is his temple, signifying to history and to the world that his only desire is for peace, and it is Vespasian who has brought peace. Here, in the middle of the letter, there had obviously and intentionally been left a blank space. Across it, Titus had inscribed a message in his own hand. How like him to revive the old cipher we once shared when communicating the amorous talents of certain Roman ladies. Simply remember the phrasing key. Pupus, flapper, atu, epsetuv, de chuvie, which became primus clamor, attic, impetus, rem, decrevit. If you simply substituted the preceding third and legitimate letter for every letter that caused a word to become gibberish. Titus had written, "As your friend must warn you, arrival, Pomponius Falco, handle, extreme caution, do not know why Father employed him, but assure dangerous. Dear princely friend, you are a trifle late, but I do appreciate your confirmation of my own opinion." And the balance of the letter needs no interpretation in words. Its words clang. On the receipt of this, it is of the utmost importance you take Masada immediately. Losses of our legionaries are to be disregarded, and you will only be held to account if victory is delayed. The Emperor and I are deeply concerned over this pocket of resistance, this taunting of our claim to universal peace. We are embarrassed by its situation at home and cannot cover it longer. Worse, we may have a very real fear that if those on Masada are able to hold out even a short while longer, they may inspire new uprising throughout Palestine. Salutes, old comrade. I need hardly remind you that you bear not only the dignity and pride of Rome with your standards, but the honor of Vespasian himself. Silva's good eye roved once more across the paper and then focused upon the Spanish sword. With the words of Titus still thundering across his mind, he saw once more a march he had known in the sweet memory of long ago. It was now difficult to believe there had not been so much as a scratch on the blade that morning, when you shared an isolated rise in the land with another youth, called Titus Flavius Vespasianus. The hump projected like a monstrous tit from the floor of the Rhone Valley, and from it you watched the passage of a fresh army bound to restrain the German tribes. It was indeed a morning to hold forever in the mind's eye. There were alpine snows glittering against the sky, and the blue-green fields of the valley spread out like a lush carpet for the parade. Even the river itself, rumbling and thrashing under the driving night of fast-melting snows, seemed exhilarated by the morning. The two of you, the rawest of youthful tribunes, leaned on the necks of your horses and critically observed the style of the first lightly armed auxiliaries, who served as scouts before the main body.
and you had agreed they exposed themselves overmuch. Next in line were two cohorts of regularly armed footmen flanked by horsemen. You approved. A good formation. Then came the engineers carrying their arms, but with their tools behind them in carriages. Dull fellows all, you agreed. And then the veteran General Vespasian himself, followed by his elite corps of footsmen, horsemen, and pikemen. So passed the vanguard, their javelin heads and pike tips glistening in the morning sun. Those were better days and better climbs for two young soldiers who thought they knew everything. He wiped the sweat from his eyes and thought how marvelously the mind of youth could store an impression. Here, though, I melt in Judea. I can still hear the rhythmic chink of equipment echoing across a distant valley. I can hear a shouted order, a complaint, or even laughter of those long-gone ghosts. Who would ever have thought on such a bracing morning, with Nero on the throne, that Vespasian would one day take his place? Once again, he could see the line of march as clearly as he could hear the gushing Rhone. There was a gap in the column, and then came a troop of more than 100 cavalry. They were followed by a pack train of mules carrying the needed gear for siege in the wilderness of Gaul or Germany, and then finally the two legions marked at their heads by eagle ensigns representing dominion. They were followed by the trumpeters, so young they were treated by some as children, and then the main column with 6 men in ranks. On that morning it had been inconceivable any people could long withstand the might of Rome. And it is transpired the tribesmen were not overly difficult when they could be brought to direct battle. The Empservii, the Tencteri, the Usipi, and the Tubiantes, the Chatti, and the Terushi, and the Hermunduri, all met in one circumstance or another during the first campaign. What a stink! Arabs and the Jews were as jasmine by comparison. He pushed the letter aside and concluded that he must be aging faster than his years deserved, if he found such pleasure in reviewing the past. By the gods, there was no time for such useless reflections now. The orders were unmistakable, and it was typical of distant princes to ignore the very real obstacles in the local field. Attack at once. Press on until victory and disregard losses. On the plains or even in the forest of Germany, compliance would be simple enough. But here, sheer determination and courage could not immediately bridge the physical gap between sword and enemy. It would be another week at least until the ramp would be done, and then who could be sure how many assaults would be necessary? Who knew what the heat would do to the soldiers already near the limit of the tolerance? Then all the more important this meeting with Eleazar. And where was his answer, not to mention the woman who supposedly bore it? He was about to send an inquiry to Gemenius when he again heard the voices of his guards outside the tent. He restrained himself from rushing to the entrance, but he rose from his chair and stood easily as if impatience were unknown to him. He saw a movement of the leather entrance flaps, then the stolid faces of Paternus and Severins, and moving just behind them was not Gemenius with Sheva, as he had presumed, but Pompronius Falco, who stepped quickly around the guards, and with a confident air Silva found infuriating, crossed the carpet toward him. "What are you doing here?" he grunted. or has my tent become a thoroughfare for the sleepless? Since this is only my second call upon my Judean host, I thought he might be more hospitable, Falco replied with a forced yawn. I must say I really do not sleep very soundly in your nasty desert, and perhaps it is just as well, since the essence of duplicity seems to be everywhere about. You talk in circles, Pomponius Falco. State your business and be gone. I have a busy night scheduled. How he reeks of perfume, Silva thought. I would as lief sniff the scalp of a German tribesman. Indeed you have, General. And may I be the first to congratulate your cunning? I beg your forgiveness for previously underestimating you, and perhaps now I humble myself you will appoint me to take him back to Rome. After all, the purpose of my visit will have been accomplished, and there will be no reason to further impose upon your good. What are you raving on about? Eleazar Ben Yair, of course. Heed the bastard's way of insinuating he knows much more than he possibly could, Silva thought. Suddenly we are partners. Is this overconfident fraud implying he may put in an invaluable word for me at home? Following his thoughts is like chasing a butterfly through the forest. Falco, the longer I am in Judea, the shorter my patience, and I have been here too long. Now, quickly, what exactly is your supplication? There you are, classifying me as a supplicant again, when I warned you of my refusal to tolerate. Silva slammed his fist on the table, and I now warn you to give me a sensible reason for your midnight invasion on this tent immediately, or you are going back to your own in chains. Temper, temper, General. Falco cocked his head to one side and held up an admonishing finger. How unwise of you to confine me when I hold the key to your whole career, perhaps your future happiness, perhaps your very life. You're drunk. Somehow that sounds odd coming from you all. Though no one could deny your qualifications for recognizing fuddlement in the brilliant. Falco paused and with the tip of his little finger touched delicately at the paint on his eyelids. My only wish is to congratulate you, sire, on this master stroke of strategy, whereby you intend to seize the leader of the Jews and forever silence his skillful tongue. Masada will fail at once, and assuredly I will applaud your campaign to the most influential of Roman ears. To cover his surprise, Silva muttered sourly that he could get along very well without the help of meddlesome opportunists. But now he sensed a challenge in Falco's manner, which went far beyond his customary insolence. For reasons I confess mystify me, Falco said easily, Eleazar has literally thrown himself into your omnipresent chains. He has agreed to meet you halfway up the snake path tonight when Jupiter is at the zenith. He will not be armed, and he will be alone. Who put those words in your mouth? Need you ask, since you chose the messenger and sent her? And very clearly, and very clever of you to think of using a woman. They have a way of allaying certain elemental fears in a man, thus blinding him to the unexpected. Where is she? Silva glanced at his sword and barely resisted an urge to sink it in Falco's groin. Presently, she is my guest, as I am yours, although she does not have to bear the insults you have directed toward me, which, by the by, I do not propose to endure any longer. I find your opinions vary between the boring and the annoying, and suggest from this time on you demonstrate how even a dull soldier may improve his manners. I'm gonna kill you, Silva said, fighting to keep his voice calm. Falco smiled and said, I doubt if you will be so impetuous, since your Jewess is presently with my Usipats, and may I remind you of their rather brutish nature as well as their reputation for absolute obedience to whomever they serve. If I do not appear before them by noon tomorrow unharmed, they have instructions. Your head will decorate a pike beside my personal standard. Now where is the woman, and be quick about it. Falco smiled tolerantly. Come now, General, may I recommend you be as sensible as your precious Jewess, who hesitated hardly a breath when given the choice between voluntarily explaining her mysterious descent from Masada or suffering certain ugly forms of encouragement to speech. She is as wise as she is clever, and could not understand why one Roman might wish to withhold information from another when both are engaged in the same enterprise. Falco shook his head as if in pity and appeared to be so completely at ease, Silva decided he at least understood how he had risen so rapidly in Vespasian's court. Without really listening, he heard Falco saying, You, my military stud, are the romantic. In contrast, your Jewess surveys the practical future, and she has asked herself if it would please her general to retrieve a mutilated body. She is, in the way of all females, a pragmatist, and therefore knows that one day you will forget the whole affair, particularly if she is near to please you. Come now, my dear brave general, would you deny she has used her intelligence? Here is a woman who has cast aside sentiment and reached for life. Would you prefer some stupid female enamored with a vision of herself as the silent heroine? Would you deny it is a greater pleasure to lie with an intelligent female rather than with some noble and imbecilic slut? You must admit the conquest of a woman's thoughts, providing she has any, can be far more exciting than merely slathering about her pubes. There is no substitute for brains, dear dull-witted warrior, and even you may now realize how those of a man and a woman grinding together may sometimes produce the powder of imagination. Thus, it is possible for even the most mediocre of individuals to become passionate mates. Falco paused to examine the 2 jeweled rings on his little fingers. He held them before him momentarily, comparing them. I bought these from a merchant in Rhodes, intending them as a gift to you. However, soon after we sailed, I discovered the stones were fake, and the rings were nearly worthless, so I kept them to remind myself what a poor man of business I am. I shall now demonstrate that I have actually learned nothing by offering to return your Jewess intact, at a very modest price. Indeed, you not even open your purse. All I ask is that you provide sufficient horses and provisions to keep my party comfortably for, say, 10 days, and because of your open regard for me and your natural generosity, I will be pleased to deliver both Jew and Jewess to Rome, the man Eleazar to represent the gift of Masada from yourself to Vespasian, and the woman for your later pleasures. Silva rose very slowly from the table. He avoided Falco's eyes and pretended to concentrate on the task of re-rolling Titus's letter. He was pleased that his fingers remained so steady as he manipulated the paper. Where was Jimenez? How had this nauseating peacock managed to intercept Sheva when he could not positively possibly have known of her departure? When he had finished with the letter, he placed it carefully in a bronze bowl. Then he walked slowly around the table, casually, as if he had lost all interest in the conversation. Finally he halted before Falco, facing him with his hands tightly clutched at his back, and he thought, I must be very careful for the next few minutes, then it will not matter. He spoke slowly and with particular solemnity, as if he had carefully considered a project and found it worthy. You are the one with imagination, Pomponius Falco. Yes, I do agree, Eleazar ben Yair could represent more than a mere man, and no doubt he could be exploited at home. Furthermore, I see no reason why you should not be appointed my envoy to deliver him as you suggest, providing, of course, no harm has come to the woman. I assure you, sire, since she has not been long gone from the camp, she cannot be far away. Where is she? If I told you, it would be the end of your Jewess. The Usipats will release her only as Pomponius Falco. The Usipats will release her only to Pomponius Falco, and he must appear before them in his present excellent state of health. If you will reflect a moment, perhaps, you will understand how anxious I am she be returned to you without blemish. I am far more interested in what may happen on my return to Rome than I am in satisfying your sensual hungers. But I am fully aware one may not be favorably accomplished without the other. It is Eleazar that I prize. I have given my right hand. No harm will come to Eleazar. How silly of you. So you larded your stuffy honor with the anachronism of your right hand. All of you soldiers are living in a world long gone. No one of any sophistication believes in gloria patria any longer. We have risen above such adolescence. You may be sure the Jew will kill you if he has the chance. Wait. Falco bent forward and peered into Silva's eyes. He pouted his lips for a moment, then slowly sucked in his breath. Wait. It is possible our dear general is even more clever than I supposed. Could it be he is simply going to chat with the Jew, and, scoundrel though he may be, allow him to run back to his fortress? Well, there is something about the whole affair that is beginning to smell quite differently. Perhaps this tent is merely a scab covering a pustule of treason. Falco tapped his head with his long forefinger. How blind I have been! How naive! I failed to ask myself why our great and brave general should behave in this way. Unless the Jew holds some great treasure, he would secretly trade for his personal safety. Silva felt his hands close on Falco's neck before he realized his arms had moved. He dug his thumbs into his throat and pressed until Falco sank to his knees. Falco gagged, his mouth fell open, and his words of protest were drowned in phlegm. And still Silva pressed relentlessly until he saw Falco's eyes slide upward beneath the lids, and felt his body become limp. Only then did he relinquish his grip and let him slip to the carpet. He clapped his hands for Paternus and Severins, and when they stood looking at the slowly writhing figure on the carpet, he said, Our friend suffers from too much sun. Remove him to his tent and post 6 men to keep him there. Tell the centurion Clemens to make up some chains so he will not be tempted to overexpose himself again. As they heaved Falco to his feet, Silva was relieved to see that he was breathing, and a hint of color had returned to his face. For a while, he thought, even Pomponius Falco will not feel like being a nuisance. Poor fellow. Like so many of the hangers-on at court, his ambitions exceeded his training and capabilities. He had not even learned a most primary lesson in military tactics. Never personally inform the enemy you hold something he values. He buckled on his sword and took his helmet from his stand. So I am an innocent, Pomponius Falco. So I am an innocent, Pomponius Falco? Perhaps. Yet after nearly a lifetime in the field, my standard is still flying. And for the moment, Sheva is as safe in your care as she would be on the mountain. By morning, you will order your Usapats to deposit her most gently back in her own tent, and by next week, who knows, she may well be on her way to Praeneste. Eleazar ben Yair had hesitated only a moment when he encountered the sentries posted at the eastern gate. He agreed with them on the relative coolness of the night, and stood back while they opened the heavy door. Fortunately, they were a different group than those who had been standing guard when he had sent the woman back to the Romans. Because they stood in the deep shadows of the casement, he could not see their faces, yet he sensed their curiosity as plainly as if they had expressed it. Has Eleazar lost his wits? What possible business could their leader have on the serpent's path at this hour alone, and since they could not see the knife in his tunic, apparently unarmed? He had debated asking them not to discuss his departure, and had then decided the request would only add mystery to an already intriguing event. Romans could order. Jews could not, and to hope his departure would be kept even a temporary secret was asking an impossible restraint of Semitic nature. Of course they would discuss it, hopefully at such length he would be back on the summit before word reached the council. When they learned of his action, they would most certainly demand an explanation as to why they had not been consulted. How had he dared consort with the most vicious murderer of Jews since Florus? And if there was any hope in such a meeting, then he would have taken one of the council along to approve or disapprove, and so on. Oh yes, the politicians will accuse thee of conniving, and the priest will accuse thee of sinning, and so on and on. Shalom. What are you? Peace was not to be found either inside or outside of Masada. And now be honest with yourself. Admit your consent to meet with Silva had very little to do with the people of Masada. You agreed because a wild-eyed female accused you of false pride and dared say you thirsted for power. You agreed because you have secretly nursed an almost overwhelming desire to meet face to face with Flavius Silva. No matter how you might explain this need to the council, they would not comprehend how he had become an invisible presence within you, an ogre marching through the hours of even your troubled sleep. Flavius Silva is all Romans. He is as much the symbol of Roman rule as his own glittering standards. Now that the chance has come to you, must see into his eyes and discover this Lord of Evil to be a lesser man than your fears have created. You must find him as weak and as susceptible to fear as any other human being, or you are lost. The risk you take this night is for yourself, and you must continue to be honest with yourself. Dedicate these next hours to Eleazar ben Yair. As he picked his way cautiously down the twisting path, he wondered how he would behave if Silva proved to be a disappointment. Oh, there was perplexity. The diminutive figure you have observed from the heights of Masada is an unreal toy soldier possessed of certain offensive characteristics with which you have endowed him. You, who do not know whether he is a big man or a small man. You, who have no idea how he will appear standing alone. How will his manner be? And will the man who climbs the path actually be Flavius Silva, or a substitute of near likeness who might be a sacrifice to some wholly new plan of attack? I know, I will know, he whispered. I will know the man. Glancing at the sky, he reassured himself Jupiter was still ascending, and thus he was well ahead of time. He intended to be, for at approximately the halfway point, the path made a double twist. There, the shale base was so loose passage across it could only be accomplished slowly and with the greatest caution. Here, just above that place, he would wait and observe Silva's climb. There was not even a remote possibility of his being surprised, for the entire eastern base of Masada lay before him in the starlight, and Jupiter now stood like a beacon overhead. Near him he could easily distinguish the tortured features of the mountain's sheer face, and beyond the wadi at the bottom he could make out details on the circumvallation. He glanced upward and was astounded at Masada's apparent union with the heavens. It had been almost 3 years since he had achieved such a view, and he had forgotten how different every aspect of the desert appeared from this low altitude. Masada itself was much more imposing, but then so were the towers projecting from the Roman circumvallation. Also, the wall itself seemed considerably higher. He positioned himself so he could observe not only the very bottom of the path, but also oversee its wandering course through the brush to the Roman wall. When he was satisfied with the solitude, he sat down on a rock to wait. The centurion Rosianus Geminus had faltered, and his highly polished military instinct reminded him Silva was more likely to smile upon a man who openly confessed his mistake rather than sought ways to execute it. As they approached the eastern circumvallation, he presented the facts to Silva as they had actually occurred, hoping by such frankness to avoid painful inquiry. Seizing this moment of obvious preoccupation for his general, he hoped he might not even be heard, or his punishment would at least be postponed. I should have been more curious, sire. But I detest taking to excuse me. But I detest talking to men who would be women, and so I ignored their presence when I should have wondered why they would come so far from their own quarters. Later, when the Germans appeared, I thought it strange, but I hesitated to leave the wall and make inquiries because I was alone, and the woman was already overdue. Because Silva remained silent, Jimenez became increasingly uneasy. He scratched at his great black beard and debated the wisdom of complimenting Silva's ability to quickly cover ground in spite of his limp. "As you ordered, sire. I sent away the regular guards on this section, and they were very glad to be relieved. And as soon as they were out of sight, the females with balls came along and began to taunt me until finally they got to my temper and I had after them." "How far from your assigned post did you chase them?" "Not at all, sire. I would not leave a post unless I was carried away dead. I was always in the area, but they were quick as deer and dodging among the rocks, and saying things to aggravate a man past his patience, and I thought to teach them respect for their betters." "There were Falco's 2 boys, and how many Germans?" "I was never sure, sire, because they kept their distance from the wall." "How in the dark could you be so sure they were Germans?" "Sire?" Seeing that Silva was still more preoccupied than angry, he ventured a note of humor. "My nose could be quite sure. When did you realize you had been duped?" "Not much later, sire. I remember chasing one of them just over there, behind those rocks. It is not far, as you can see. Then I returned to the wall and waited, looking up the path for some sign of the Jewess. The female boys continued to harass me for a while, and suddenly they were gone, and I saw the Germans had also disappeared. I could see the path all the way to the top of Masada, and there was no movement on it. I knew then something had gone wrong." "You were the something. However, I may be influenced in adjusting your punishment by the outcome of this night's events. Now listen carefully, and have a care you do not fault these orders." Silva removed his helmet and unbuckled his sword. He handed them both to Jimenez. "Sire?" Jimenez shook his head in bewilderment. "You are to remain here at the wall. Regardless of any further distractions, you will keep your eyes on Masada. At the slightest sign of any unusual movement along the summit, you are to call out a warning to me. At the sound of your voice, you will be joined immediately by 2 maniples of the first cohort, who are now waiting just beyond the rise. You will lead them with all speed to the base of Masada and up the path, where I hope you will find me still very much alive. If all remains quiet, as now, you will wait here for my return, though it may not be until dawn." "Do I make myself clear, Jimenez?" "But, sire, you are practically naked." He fingered the sword and helmet unhappily. "I find it a rather pleasant sensation. I feel curiously light." They moved along the wall to the place where Silva had ordered temporary steps, constructed to ease Sheva's original journey. They mounted the wall, and as Silva started down the opposite side, Jimenez held out his sword. "Sire, if you will not take me, whatever business you have with the Jews, it will cut better with this." Silva pushed the hilt aside, then quickly stepped down the steps. In the starlight, Jimenez was able to follow his limping finger until the path dipped into a wadi. Then he was gone. As he climbed, the path became increasingly steep of incline, and the footing less sure. By the gods, he thought, little wonder Eleazar Ben Yair had agreed to the meeting. If this was the only way to him, any sort of formal attack was hopeless. He negotiated a double turn in the path and paused to ease his breathing. It is curious, he thought. Here on the side of a mountain in Judea, you remember something Titus said long ago when he was told construction had started on the house in Praeneste. By all means make provisions for a tennis court, my friend. I know of no physical endeavor which will keep you so vital. And you had persuaded yourself soldiering was enough to keep any man fit. Yet perhaps it is not, if mountain climbing is any criterion. He looked down at the void below and instantly looked up at the stars again. A place for goats. If I look down again, I shall vomit. Just after the shale he had disturbed ceased rattling, he heard an answering slide above him. He looked up quickly, expecting to see a man silhouetted against the stars, but there was nothing. He waited, and though he could now hear his own heart pounding, he managed to keep his voice casual when he said in Latin, "Show yourself, Jew! I will climb no further." He was startled to hear a voice address him in Greek. It was Eleazar Ben Yair's voice, close behind him. He whirled about and raised his arms defensively. Then he saw a man standing in the turn of the path he had just passed. He was saying, "Experience has convinced me it is rather safer to let a Roman pass and make sure what his splendid facade is hiding. I have come unarmed. So I assured myself. At first I thought you were wearing a helmet. Then I saw that what I thought a helmet was only an illusion created by your fair hair." Eleazar's voice faded as he moved closer to Silva. He muttered in Hebrew, "What kind of a monster hast thou created in the shape of this man?" They stood in silence only a few paces apart. Eleazar was nearly a head taller than Silva, yet the incline of the path made them seem to be of equal height. Examining Silva, he saw his breastplate embossed with crouching lions, trumpeters, and rearing horses. And he saw that when he decided to use the knife, the target would be easy, for Silva's entire neck was exposed. "You are a younger man than I had supposed," Eleazar said. "And you are larger than I thought," Silva answered. "I hope your wisdom matches your bulk. If you live on a mountain, the view is broad. It is the people who live in valleys who have difficulty comprehending what lies beyond." There was silence again until Silva moved his foot. The sound of his sandal brushing against the loose shale caused both men to tense, and for a time they stood like two fearful animals poised for attack. Then gradually their quick breathing subsided. "Do you have family?" Silva demanded. "There is no reason to raise your voice, General. I am neither your slave nor one of your poor legionaries. But since you have made inquiry, with as much politeness as I suppose any Roman is capable, I will tell you we are all one family on Masada. I will also remind you Judea is our given home, now unfortunately crowded with boorish visitors. You may serve your speeches for the public ear. I have not made this climb to hear such stuff or more of the fatuous declarations of which you are so fond. Apparently, you believe words serve you as both shield and weapon. Perhaps they do, but now you are burdened with them." Silva paused, then suddenly all he had wanted to say for so long came rushing to his thoughts. It was as if he had nurtured the words for years and had at last found audience for them, as if their final release also freed Flavius Silva of all doubt. And strangely, his voice seemed to accuse himself as well as Eleazar ben Yair. "You have stood before your people and promised them victory, being careful to ignore the power of numerals and deliberately vague about the date of victory. There is nothing new in such leadership. The kind of lies you so glibly serve have been told to the near vanquished since the first battle was fought. You declare you are winning, which you know very well is a lie, since you know it cannot happen, so you declare some mysterious force will arrive at the last minute to defeat your enemies. These lies were told 1,000 times before Masada, and I suppose will be told long after we are gone. You tell these lies because you are clever enough to know that if you admit the truth, your followers will lay down their arms and make the best of life they can. I will confess we Romans are experts at such persuasions." Silva paused and sighed. He seemed to be a man removed from the scene, as if he were talking to himself. The curious thing about this ancient device is that you often convince yourself as well as your followers, and there, unless the numerals are in your favor, lies disaster. Now I have come to you tonight because I suspect you are not a fool, but may be a victim of your own eloquence. Perhaps in spite of your lofty view, you have managed to blindfold yourself. Certainly, you have not considered honestly the numerals, or you would have surrendered by now. I have come to you as one soldier to another in the hope you will at least be realistic and save your people. I have come to offer you life. It was so quiet Silva could hear Eleazar's heavy breathing. Only by listening carefully could he detect the sounds from the ramp on the opposite side of Masada. For once he wished they could be louder. "I am a soldier," Eleazar was saying. "I am a son of God who will protect us from your numerals." "Nonsense! You know it. Even your God must understand you have less than 500 fighting men, and I have more than 5,000. It is as simple as that. And I have the Hebrew sun, which will soon melt your armor." Silva sighed. Without a doubt, Jews were the most unreasonable people in all the world. "You do not seem to comprehend," he said patiently. "Within 2 days, 3 at the most, my ramp will be at your western gate. No matter what you do, or what your God decides, or our machines will be pounding on your wall, and in a matter of hours we will be inside. It will be too late then. Once they are on top, I cannot hold my legionaries, much less the auxiliaries. I cannot say to them, 'You have fought hard to get here. Now desist.' Even if I tried, they would not listen. In a sense, I am burdened with the same sort of declarations you are. I have told my officers and men to endure the heat and discomfort only a little longer and victory will be ours. I have told them we will go to better surroundings then. I have come to tell you in private what I cannot admit before an audience of 20,000 people. Now that so much energy and expense have been involved, I cannot possibly admit that I think your deaths will be meaningless to Rome, and the few legionaries I will lose in the final assault will be good men wasted. We have brought peace to Palestine for the first time in many years. No matter what happens here in the desert, we will continue to rebuild it and make it prosper. I am trying to convince you that your continued resistance is not only hopeless, but utterly worthless. And if you refuse to recognize this as the true situation, then the vaunted Jewish intelligence is overrated. We cannot but lie to each other with our followers heeding our every word. We are leaders, so we must, whether we will or not, boast and threaten and constantly parade our pride. Here alone I hope we meet as human beings. So I say again to you, Jew, I have come to offer you life. After a moment Eleazar said softly in Hebrew, I have seen the wicked in great power and spreading himself like a green bay tree. What was that you said? Silva asked. My Hebrew is limited. Just something that occurred to me, a phrase which really belongs to our priest. He paused, then moved slightly to one side of the light from Jupiter would better shine on Silva's face. You are a curious soldier, he began, and a curious Roman. I have listened to you in wonder. For since when does the butcher suddenly turn away his knife and say to the sheep, Run along now before I change my mind? You offer us life? Are the Jews laboring on your ramp alive? Are those alive who work your mines and build your canals, move your galleys, and furnish sport in your arenas? Alive? Even the privilege of dying when they chose is denied them. It comes only when you choose. If you are offering us complete amnesty, and if you guarantee we will be allowed to return to our normally fruitful lives, then I suppose it would be my duty to at least present your new policy to my council of elders. Do you make such an offer? You know that is impossible. Of course I do. Therefore I wonder why we stand here any longer. My curiosity is satisfied. I know what you look like, and it is reassuring to find that my information about your bad eye and leg was accurate. There are many other things we know about you, your trials and plans. You are bluffing. There is nothing to know other than what I have already laid before you. So, what about the 5 mutineers you sent to their deaths this morning? What about your devotion to the grape? What about the woman Sheva? You may be sure there is nothing occurring in any of your camps about which we are not informed. This very night, a messenger arrived from Rome with a dispatch for you. Unfortunately, our system is not so thorough as to reveal its contents. Yet, by splicing 2 broken ropes together, we can usually make one whole, and I would guess your arrival here and the message are not unrelated. You are quite right about the numerals, and may I remind you, all Jewish children learn to count at a very early age. But you are not nearly so perceptive in your estimation of Masada's power. We have weapons and supplies and water enough to fight another 10 years. You are in trouble because of Masada, and because of you, Rome is in trouble. The only solution you can see is to knock us off the mountain or talk us into becoming your slaves. We will not submit to your exploitation of our people any more than we applaud your colonial obsessions. You are still making speeches. The rabble you call your family are the dregs of Jerusalem, with a few half-wits and cripples picked up along the way. Not 1 in 10 of them would know what you are talking about when you object to Roman rule. Of course we are colonialists. And the finest. This very night, thousands upon thousands of Jews sleep peacefully under the protection of Roman arms. Do you have any notion what we have done for the entire world? My teachers were careful to explain what you have done to it, but could find very little to say about what you have done for it. Even so, because we are peace-loving people, we are willing to forsake vengeance and compromise. Silva shook his head in disbelief. I envy your ability to act the victor when you are as good as condemned. If you will remove your troops from the desert, we will remain here and not interfere with your actions in the rest of Palestine. You are mad. I cannot even consider such a proposal. Of course not. Because with typical Roman arrogance, you are convinced only might wins. In some ways I pity you, Flavius Silva, particularly on the day when you discover it is not true. Eleazar reached into his tunic and pulled out his knife. He held the blade so the starlight would reflect on it as he turned it slowly around. I brought this along because I have no cause to trust any Roman. Had I not found you were at least somewhat different, I might have decided to kill you. He tossed the knife carelessly away. It was still clattering down the mountain when he said, "But you are a poor man who does not believe, a wretched man who doubts the use of might, or you would not have come here. Soon enough, I believe, you will kill yourself." Eleazar deliberately turned his back on Silva and started slowly towards the stars. Later, still breathing heavily from the exertion of his climb, he lowered himself to the pallet beside Miriam. And at once he knew her eyes were open in the darkness. So he said, "Go to sleep." And she replied, "Where have you been so late?" Is there a wife in the world who has never asked that question? I have been talking with a Roman. I am having a nightmare. Flavius Silva. Of course you have. How silly of me not to realize it, Eleazar. I do not mind your fancy words, but when you start lying to your wife, I found him a very interesting man. He is somewhat shorter than I supposed. What a disappointment. Let me tell you, dear Eleazar, that I love you, as I have told you 10,000 times. I know you are a great man, far greater than any other on this mountain, and I know you must sometimes stretch the truth for the sake of our people, but I wish you would not bring those half-truths to this little home and ask me, who know and love you so well, to believe your every word. It often takes a great deal of imagination to believe the truth. I will not disturb you with further facts, if you will go to sleep. There was a moment's silence between them. Then she whispered, "How can I sleep when our world is coming to an end? It is not yet the end. There is still much we can do. I beg you be truthful with me. What will happen to Reuben?" "I do not know. Let us first control what happens to ourselves, then we can best plan for him." "I'm not interested in myself." "Very noble of you. You set the tone with the noble speeches, but words do not drive away Romans. You are right upon right, dear wife. They only seem to bring them." He rolled over on his side, away from her, and for a long time in the darkness he tried to drive his thoughts away from envisioning Flavius Silva and himself as the two loneliest men in the world. Wash me. Wash me carefully, dear Cornelius, Falco whimpered. Wash the filthy hands of that monster from my throat and my face, here too, where he touched me. Pomponius Falco lay outstretched on his couch, his hands manacled behind his back, his ankles fitted with heavy bronze clasps, and connected with such a short length of chain he found it difficult to move more than a few paces. In his despair he had sought his couch, hoping its familiarity would ease his newborn fears. But his helplessness was only emphasized when he was obliged to ask Albinus if he would assist him in urinating. One does not realize how inaccurate one's aim is, he said, looking down at the wetted carpet. When one's hands are behind one's back. You know how fastidious I am about these things. Hold the pot higher, dear boy. There, he sighed. Now wash me. Earlier, he had submitted with cold dignity to the muttered request of the armorer, who asked him to move his arms and legs so he could fix the chains. He saw the shock of incredulity in the eyes of Cornelius and Albinus as they stood watching the process, and hoping to reassure them, said, I am glad you can bear witness to this monstrous insult, which, believe me, will be repaid 1,000 times in the almost immediate future. You will soon have further entertainment. You will see a certain Roman general enter his tent on his knees, literally on his knees, and you will hear him plead with me not to breathe a word of this in Rome. You will witness him lament how it was all a dreadfully stupid mistake on his part, and you will hear him drown us in apologies. This I promise you. While the armorer worked silently about his ankles and wrist, each blow of his hammer seemed to excite Falco the more, until his whole body trembled, and his voice broke repeatedly as he addressed Cornelius and Albinus. Silva is mad, do you understand? Mad. Have you noticed his eyes? Or eye, one should say. His brain needs an enema. Deranged. Hopelessly insane. Look what he is doing to a friend of the emperor. If you knew what I know, then you would join me in anticipating the scene when the same muscular oaf who now secures these chains. Have you noticed how well made he is, by the way? When this same man sweats to take them off again, with Silva himself standing where you are and urging him to hurry, that will be a show, I assure you. An hour from now, 2 hours at the most, and you will behold the spectacle of a famous general literally dribbling spittle in his anxiety to free me, because he will want to know where his Jewess is, and I am the only person in all Palestine who knows. Our barely tamed Usipats, who presently keep her company, have neither the wit nor the language to communicate their whereabouts to anyone. If indeed they had the slightest desire to do anything but spend their time picking lice from each other. I alone know where Silva's precious Jewess is. And I will now express my gratitude to you, dear boys, for providing me with such a sharp weapon. I shall not forget that it was you who put what you saw and heard together, and you particularly, dear Albinus. You knew something was unnatural. You are to be complimented upon your powers of deduction as well as observation. Then let us recognize the proper use of such information is one of my special talents, and see the result. Ah, You may well inquire how it is that I am being put in chains by this beautiful oaf if I have employed my knowledge wisely. The truth is, our general is in a state of shock. Thus his violent reactions, which he will so deeply regret. The madman in him has become all the more irrational because of his lust for this Oriental woman. Who but a maniac would choose a female whelped in an Egyptian ghetto? Yet never mind. You will soon have the extraordinary pleasure of seeing him humiliated far more abjectly than these simple chains can affect me. I have not yet devoted my full imagination to his repayment for this absurd situation. I have deliberately refrained from it, as one might postpone the most delectable morsel on one's plate, or an orgasm with a new-found boy. Yes, I will tease him for a while, even seeming to forgive him if it suits my mood, toy with him until we can hear him panting in his anxiety. No matter how he denies it, I am the key to his life. I am the only person in the world who can rescue Silva's future, and he knows it. I alone suspect his treachery, and I need only wait to prove it. But I will not think further on how he may best be rewarded until I can lie down in these chains and let their harsh surface torment the body you both so love. I will let them remind me how General Flavius Silva is a traitor to Rome. When the armorer had finished and had taken his leave, Falco commanded Cornelius to oil his face and neck. He considered weeping to better impress Cornelius and Albinus with his suffering, but soon decided against it as contrary to his role as an ultimate victor. Now, as he relaxed, his voice became increasingly melodious, and as he eyed his two attendants, his smile became winsome, and he seemed to purr. Dear Cornelius, dear Albinus, I cannot suitably express my appreciation of your love. We have been through so much together. Perhaps I have been severe with you occasionally, but never have I thought to dismiss you from my household. Yes, Albinus, when we return to Rome, and are received with approbation and honor, then we will do something specific about your bondage. I will make the necessary arrangements, and within a reasonable time you will be free. Cornelius, dear boy, perhaps we should give a party to celebrate Albinus's manumission. Whom shall we invite? Perhaps we should already make plans for what we will serve and what we should do for entertainment. It must be a party that will be the talk of Rome for years to come. Cornelius ceased his rubbing away of the oil and stood back expectantly. He cocked his head curiously as Falco continued speaking, and soon, as if he wished to form an audience, Albinus came to stand beside him. Shall we have ram's vetches again? Shall we have goose liver and snails? Do you remember your Greek fables, how Tereus raped Procne's sister, Philomelia, and cut out her tongue so she wouldn't tattle? But she wove the whole story into a tapestry. This gives me an idea. Why not teach Silva's slave, Epos, to draw, and let him in that fashion tell of his master's iniquities before a suitable assembly in Rome, and thus refute any claims of diligence Silva might make. But let us not dwell on our mad general. Let us return to thoughts of our party. Shall we roast a tender Ambracian kid and mix the drippings into some exquisite sauce of our own invention? Shall we arrange to have some oysters brought down from Britain instead of the lucrinies, which are of course superb, but which everyone seems to be offering these days? Perhaps we should call in some play actors, or perhaps watch a pantomime. No? Doesn't appeal to either of you? You are both so quiet. Jaded, I should say, and frightfully spoiled. Come now, I cannot stage a circus to rouse your enthusiasm, but wait, I know. This might excite your horny little minds. Supposing we attempt something quite different for the occasion. Suppose we invite a woman, preferably one of high social rank, which should be no great problem, since her husband would hardly suspect us. And let us previously inform this grand lady she has long been secretly adored by a famous man who will await introduction to her in our midst. Nothing, I assure you, appeals to females quite like clandestine yet safe romance. Now, after hints and suggestions to arouse her erotic desires, we will confide that her illustrious friend has concealed himself in the little room which is just off the dining area. Then we have two things working for us: a secret which all women, regardless of class, cannot resist solving, and curiosity which gets them into trouble from the time they are little girls. During these preparations we will fill her with wine until she is fit to burst, then send her off to her tryst. Now, we have been careful to describe her celebrated lover as somewhat hirsute. True enough, because he is an ape we will hire for the occasion, and whose potency we will guarantee by filling him with the most effective aphrodisiacal solution on the market. Now it is dark in the room. Time passes as they wonder at each other's silence. Inevitably, she must squat to relieve herself, and instantly, ho, ho, you know what the ape will do. And when she comes out of the room, picture her face. It is not even something she will dare tell her husband. Of course, who knows about women? She might enjoy herself, in which case the joke is on us. Falco paused. His contemplation of future pleasures had allowed his thoughts to drift from the very immediate discomfort of his chains. He turned slightly on the couch and regarded Cornelius and Albinus with new interest. They had been so strangely silent, standing there staring at him, unmoving. They seemed almost removed from the tent, as if they thought they stood on a street in Rome watching the flow of traffic. "What is the matter with you two?" he asked irritably. "Can't you see I am most uncomfortable? If I have the grace to divert our thoughts temporarily, the least you could do is join in. Don't you want a party? Don't you understand what I have been saying about Silva and his need for me?" He studied their faces outlined against the dark top of the tent. They were looking down upon him, their eyes expressionless. In the yellow light their heads seemed to be carved of wax. "What is ailing you two?" he insisted. "You look like a pair of statues. Are you by chance trying to intimidate Damon and Pythias?" Neither Cornelius nor Albinus replied. They simply glanced at each other and moved closer together. Falco said, "I must look dreadful to you. Hold the mirror for me." Albinus obeyed instinctively. In a moment he was kneeling before Falco, dutifully holding his mirror. Falco squirmed on the couch, trying for a more erect position to view his face. The lamp struck his head at such an angle, it exaggerated the coarse surface of his cheeks and emphasized the new outbreaks of heat rash which had joined the older imperfections to create large unified blemishes. "Oh!" he moaned. "Ah!" Albinus moved the mirror slightly. Falco strained to keep his image within view. "Hold still, you idiot!" He studied his face reflectively, then bared his teeth and ran his tongue along his lips. "Cornelius, bring the bowl, dear boy." Like Albinus, Cornelius seemed to move in a trance. He went to the corner of the tent where they kept their immediate supplies, and took up the heavy bowl that was filled with ass's milk, and that now gave off such an odor he was obliged to hold his breathing. It was a wide-mouthed bowl of bronze, designed for facial bathing rather than a container for the transport of liquid. Thus Cornelius moved very slowly and cautiously, lest his progress across the tent cause the milk to slop in rhythm with his steps and spill over the lip of the bowl. When he arrived at the couch without accident, Falco smiled up at him. "Admirable! I shall not have to chastise you for clumsiness like the last few times you brought the milk, will I, dear boy? All of which proves that a lash well placed is well remembered." He looked up at Cornelius, and with his eyes bade him kneel. Normally he would have administered the milk to his face himself, but now he shook his head sadly. He glanced in the mirror to be certain his expression was sufficiently woeful, and said, "Tonight it is you who will apply the milk, dear Cornelius. I am obviously quite unable at the moment, so I caution you to brush it on gently, particularly on those places where the skin appears most raw. I am very sensitive, you know. Now bring the bowl closer to my face. My dear boy, don't you realize I can barely move?" Cornelius bent down and held the bowl just below the level of Falco's chin. Then he lowered it slightly, and as if by silent agreement, Albinus lowered the mirror. "Now, dear boy, proceed, and mind you, gently." Cornelius glanced at Albinus questioningly, and seemed to find confirmation in his eyes. So he braced the bowl firmly against his leg, and with his free hand seized Falco's hair. Then he pushed his head deep into the bowl, and almost simultaneously Albinus swung down with his free hand and caught the back of Falco's neck. Together they held him until his violent struggles subsided and finally ceased. And all the time they were silent, for their eyes, meeting across the head, bent between them, spoke of all they had to say. At last, when they were convinced Pomponius Falco would never draw breath again, they washed the milk from his face and from those places where his struggling had caused it to spatter on his tunic and on the carpet. Then they stretched him on the couch in an attitude of repose and closed the lids of his eyes. Cornelius returned the bowl of milk to its usual place, and Albinus removed the water and towels. Together they studied Falco's face, and we were reassured suffocation left no marks. Then Albinus blew out one lamp, and Cornelius pulled down the wick of the other until it was only a bead of light. He took Albinus's hand, and together they moved to their pallets near the entrance. They disrobed and lay down as they normally did, as if to sleep, but their eyes were wide open, and they reached for each other, and they trembled with rapture when their mouths and bodies joined.